Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Chris Scruggs. He's going to talk about the greatest session guitar player Nashville has ever seen, the great Grady Martin.
A lot of people don't realize when they listen to country records, you know, specifically if they're country records made in Nashville, which is where most of them have been for the last 7 decades. A lot of people don't realize that for the most part, it's only one main group of musicians that are playing on all the records. And that those musicians are just very, very flexible, and they know how to change their style and their sound depending on the artist that they're working with to almost sound like they're different players than who they are. You know, they would build a sound around each singer. And in Nashville, in the classic era, this term still gets used sometimes just to mean first call session musicians. But if you want to be really strict about it, there was a group of musicians called the A-Team. And they were called the A-Team because they were the first call players that Owen Bradley would use on his Decca recording sessions in the 50s, and then those guys were used by all the producers. You know, everybody for, you know, Columbia and RCA and Mercury. You know, everybody used, you know, that core group of players. If you could get them, that's who you wanted. So they were the A-Team. They were the, you know, the top of the list guys. And it was Buddy Harmon on drums, Bob Moore on bass fiddle, Harold Bradley, Ray Edenton, Hank Garland, and Grady Martin on guitars. Pig Robbins and Floyd Kramer on piano. Pig picked up when Floyd retired from session work to be an artist. And then you get into the more auxiliary kind of instruments like fiddle and steel and harmonica. You've got Charlie McCoy, who played vibes and harmonica and you know, just about everything else. You've got Tommy Jackson for fiddle, you know, Pete Drake for steel guitar. Early on, it was Bud Isaacs. Boots Randolph if there was a saxophone. But you had this core group of musicians that was sort of this, they weren't really like a band, but they were just the session musicians that everybody wanted. So they worked as a band, you know. If you were to ask anybody of that era who the most significant musician of that group was, all of them, hands down, without even thinking, just say Grady Martin, the guitar player. The thing with Grady is the respect that he got from his peers and contemporaries was just enormous. When you go back and listen to a lot of the records that he played on, there are some definite standouts, like he played the fuzz bass on Don't Worry About Me by Marty Robbins, which was the first record to have a, you know, like a fuzz style of distortion, which inspired the creation of the distortion pedal. There's his work on Marty Robbins' El Paso, where he played acoustic guitar and just played the most beautiful fills that told the story almost as well as the lyrics did. There's the sort of low string kind of, not a baritone guitar, but just in the baritone range of a guitar, kind of twangy stuff he would play like on Honky Tonk Man for Johnny Horton and people like that. He played the blues guitar on Chattanooga Shoeshine Boy for Red Foley. All those Conway records that you hear in the 60s and 70s with that really smooth liquid sounding guitar in the second verse usually, you know, kind of gives it that real tender, kind of lush, creamy sound. That's Grady on a... He had a big Gibson ES-355, everyone nicknamed Big Red, and it had palm pedals on it, and the treble side cutaway had been like custom ordered, shaved down for higher fret access. Really unusual guitar with a sound that you can hear. When you hear it on a record, you know that's Grady. He's playing Big Red. So this guitar he acquired from a guy named Dean Porter, who was a guitar player and repairman in Nashville. Grady had an Epiphone Sheraton that was damaged in a car accident, and this guitar, Big Red, was originally owned and custom ordered by Dean Porter. And when you see pictures of him 10 years earlier, he had played with Little Jimmy Dickens. Dean Porter had a Blackguard Fender Telecaster that he had cut the horn off of so he could get up to the high frets without his fingers hitting against the inside of the cutaway. So that was obviously, you know, just something about his personal playing style. He had ordered this Gibson 355 in 1959 with the treble side, you know, Mickey Mouse ear of the 335 style body, kind of like shaved down like a nub. And it had 24 frets instead of 22. And that meant the neck pickup had to be slightly closer to the bridge than it usually is. So that's part of what gives it its unique sound, this guitar. So Grady had this Epiphone Sheraton that was damaged, and he took it to Dean Porter. And Dean said, I can fix it. Do you want to trade guitars? So they ended up trading, and Dean kept Grady's Epiphone, and Grady took this 355. Dean Porter had also constructed these palm pedals, which you were asking about. And what that is it works almost like the pedal on a steel guitar, where when you press down on it, it bends a string, just one string, and not like a whammy bar where it doesn't have a set ending. Like it moves it up to a specific pitch. Kind of like what a B-bender does with the strap, only instead of pushing down on the neck of the guitar to make it work, you just use the palm of your picking hand and press down by the bridge on the palm pedal. So that was the big red guitar that Grady used, you know, through most of the 60s and 70s, like Loretta's records and, you know, just everybody. So after the sound of, you know, the session world kind of changed, and it went, you know, in more the direction where new players came in, like Reggie Young and people like that. And Grady stopped doing as much session work. And so he started doing road work, which he'd never really done before. He was always a studio rat. So then for the next, you know, 20 years after that, he was one of the guitar players with Willie Nelson. And a lot of people, when they think of Grady Martin, they think of him as that old timer that played all that real jazzy stuff in Willie's band in the 80s and 90s. And then there's people that when they think of him, they think about that real smooth kind of style that he played like in the 60s and 70s on like the Conway and the Loretta Lynn records, and that more kind of liquid guitar tone. And then there's, you know, rockabilly kids who freak out over Grady Martin because he played on a lot of records that he didn't get credit for, like for Johnny Burnett and people like that. He was just kind of one of those players where he was, and then there's people who just based off of what he played on El Paso was enough to warrant him, you know, being elected to the Country Music Hall of Fame, which he was. So Grady was just this giant of the country music world as far as the sound of the records went. A lot of the records he played on that were hits, he didn't even really do anything that was all that, you know, that wasn't like a standout. It was just, you know, the fills he would play behind the vocal. Subtle things that just made the record sound better, made it sound like a hit, you know. And I've heard people say that even if Grady was just playing like rhythm guitar or some kind of a part that wasn't taking any spotlight at all, just his presence on a session was enough to lift the room, you know. And he would kind of be, you know, he would kind of serve as leader on a lot of sessions, which by modern standards, that's a lot of the roles that producers play nowadays, as far as like telling, as coming up with ideas, telling, you know, people where to play fills. Like he was kind of the guy who'd look at people like, you play, you know, you fill this section, and nudge at him, you played this next section up here. He was an ideas kind of guy. You know, I've heard so many stories about so many key things in the sound of country music of the last 60 years where the story goes, well, so-and-so was just messing around with that, and then Grady said, no, do that again. Hey, you should do that during the song. You know, things like that. Buck Trent, you know, who played the banjo that had palm pedals on it to sound like a steel guitar, with Porter Wagner for years and years. Before he worked with Porter, he worked with the Carlisles, and they were doing a recording of Too Old to Cut the Mustard. Buck was messing with just the tuners on his banjo, which you can set to go and kind of get, you know, these twangy, you know, it predates pedal steel, but it's a similar sound. And he was messing with that, and as he says, twisting and turning. And Grady said, hey, when we record this, when on the song and your solo, you do that and you just lean into it hard, and just, you know, be relentless with it. He was like, are you sure? He said, yeah. And that's what made the record sound unique. And that was the start of kind of the Buck Trent sound on records, you know, where it was just all these kind of pedal steel sounding bends, but on a banjo. I've heard him get some of the credit for helping Ray Edenton develop what's called Nashville tuning, which is when you take the octave strings of a 12-string guitar, you know, which is basically the low 4 strings are an octave higher and the high 2 are the same pitch. And you just put those on a 6-string guitar. That he was involved in developing that with Ray Edenton, who's really who, you know, popularized it by playing it on records. I've heard him get some of the credit for encouraging Bud Isaacs to press the pedals on his steel guitar to get that, you know, modern pedal steel sound. Before that, it was all lap steel. And supposedly Bud Isaacs he played a chord and pressed the pedal to show that, hey, I can get 2 tunings at the same time. Like I played this and it's an E9 tuning, and then I press the pedals down and it's an A6 tuning. And when he pressed down the pedals, the notes were still ringing, and Grady said, you need to let people hear those notes move, because people will respond to that. You know, it's sounds almost like a fiddle or something, you know, you know, the pedal steel sound. That was Grady, who kind of encouraged a lot of other players and kind of helped shape the sound of country music outside of just his contribution as, you know, the greatest session guitar player that this town ever saw. It's so much easier nowadays because we have multi-track recording, and you can isolate things and you can overdub things, you can tune things. Back then, in order to be an artist, back in the era of people like George Jones, in order to be an artist, you had to be able to like sing like you were singing a hit record from start to finish, all the way through every take. And the musicians had to be able to play that way too. There was no like, oh, can you punch me in on the halfway point in the solo? It's like, no, man, that's it. It all, went down to, one track, and they were all in one room with everybody was bleeding onto each other's mics with their sound. And I think that because of that, the musicians, not to say that, I think that the musicians now are more sophisticated in Nashville as far as like the variety of styles that they can cover, and the maybe they're more schooled in a traditional sense. Although I will say that those players back then, a lot of them, when they got together for fun, they would play jazz. They were country players, but if they were just getting together to pick, they wanted to play, jazz or their version of jazz. Sometimes Western swing, if it was the older generation of guys. But there was something about the way that they could just go in and record a record in 2 hours. And you were saying to me a little while ago, there's this one in particular, it's a George Jones record of Hank Williams songs that they did in like 2 hours. And it helps too when you already know the material. I'm sure all of them had come up, playing in honky tonks, playing those songs. And if Tommy Jackson was playing fiddle on it, well, he played on Hank Williams records, But yeah, there's, we'll spend 2 hours now. I remember reading a thing. It's in Keith Richards' biography. He's complaining about modern recording. And he says, yeah, we made the last Stones record, and, we spent like 6 days just getting a drum sound, and it still didn't sound right. Like in 1963, they'd take one microphone and spend 5 minutes getting a drum sound, and it sounded better than what we get now. What's the deal with that? And I kind of tend to agree with that, I think using one microphone too, the drums get treated as one instrument instead of boom, boom, boom. Like these separate sounds just coming at you with their own mics and their own EQ and their own, preamps. And there's something about just treating it like one instrument. But that also meant that the drummers back then had to be better because they had to know how to mix themselves. They had to know, like you play at what sounds like a normal volume for a stage drummer, and then you record that with one microphone and the cymbals are too loud. You've got to know how to play really soft on the cymbals and hit the snare a little harder. And then when you play your fill, you got to know, well, I need to hit the rack tom a little harder than I do the floor tom, or maybe the other way around. There's just those little things about how to mix your volume in real time while you play. And that's the same too with guitar players back then. They didn't have a lot of EQ on the engineer's side. So you had to know like how to play your guitar, like what angle to hold your pick at, to move it closer to the bridge or to the neck, just little things like that. Just to give the engineers or they would move the mic like, oh, it sounds too bassy. We'll move the mic a little farther that way. Instead, nowadays they just, adjust it on a computer screen. But back then it was much more organic, and it's amazing, that they not only made records that sounded that good, but they made so many of them, that those guys worked so much, the session musicians, and that the artists could go in and sing a record in 2 hours time. And then just, onto the next thing. Aubrey Mayhew was a very eccentric character here in Nashville. He started a record label, him and Johnny Paycheck, called Little Darlin' in the 60s. And their attitude, they almost had this like middle finger kind of mission statement with that label to make just hard-hitting, in-your-face, hardcore country music records in an era when it was more like the Nashville sound. It was more strings and piano and smooth guitars and background vocals, a lot of the pop oriented, like Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves and Eddie Arnold and that sort of style. And their thing was just to make like hard hitting honky tonk country music. He was a songwriter too, Aubrey Mayhew. He produced the records for Paycheck and any other artists that, came through, but he also wrote a lot of the songs. And when you go and listen to some of those songs, they're bizarre. Like they're it's almost like kitschy, how over the top some of them are. Like, pardon me, I've got someone to kill. And if you're familiar, there's a song called The Cave about a guy who gets lost in a cave, and then like there's like nuclear Armageddon happens while he's down there, and he comes, just like really over the top, wild, kind of songs. But Aubrey Mayhew, he was also a big JFK obsessed guy. Like he had all this, JFK memorabilia specifically around the whole assassination and all of that. He was a character. He passed away only just a couple of years ago. But I mean, I think Paycheck was a bit of a character too. And what they did together was really, really amazing. And they had all the best players on those records. You know, they'd have Lloyd Green on steel, Junior Husky on bass, Billy Sanford on guitar, and Buddy Spiker on fiddles, and, the cats, the real cats. And one thing that he would do that was a little different, somebody asked him once, "What, your records, your little darling records, they sound different than everything else cut in Nashville." And he said, "That's because I have them mastered in New York instead of in Nashville." And the engineer he sent them to would really bump up the high end and make those records. I mean, when those records come on, they cut, and if anyone out there is not familiar with Johnny Paycheck's Little Darlin' era work, boy, you need to check that out. If I'm going to sink, I might as well go to the bottom. His version of A11, which was actually cut in New York with George Jones' band backing him up. At the time, Paycheck played electric bass for George Jones, so that's actually Jones's band on that record. Man, there's some great stuff in there. Lovin' Machine is another one. Jukebox Charlie, where Lloyd's playing just, any higher up and only dogs would be able to hear him. But, that's what they wanted to do with those records, was just be as in your face and unapologetically country and no subtlety, just like, country records that just, hit you in the face. Him and Jones and I'd say Farron Young had this thing to be able to sing in such a way where they put like so much, like such a wide range of emotion into every word, where like they almost didn't need to sing words and you could tell what they're singing about. There was just like so much, I don't want to say it was over the top, but it was, it was not nuance oriented. It was very dramatic. There's that record too that Jones and Paycheck did where they did just like duets of 50s rock and roll songs. You ever heard that one? And it's funny because it's almost hard to tell which one is which. It sounds like a badly comped vocal of one person, where like the lines intersect and it's like, it almost sounds like it's one person singing, but there's slight differences. But that's the age old argument, because Paycheck played bass for Jones for a number of years, is like who influenced who, because Jones didn't sing the same coming out of that partnership that he sang before. I mean, he definitely sounded like George Jones before that, but there were details in the way that he sang that took shape while him and Paycheck worked together. And it makes you wonder, like, who influenced who? There's probably a little bit of both, probably some cross-pollination. That happens when you sing on one microphone with somebody. But I love Waylon's records, and I love that sound. I mean, it's a West Texas kind of thing, It doesn't sound like Buddy Holly's music, but there's like, you listen to something like Well All Right by Buddy Holly, and it's a do 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 G F G do 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 G F, that 1 and the 7 the 1. That's sort of like, it's got this rocky desert kind of out there kind of sound. And I mean, maybe that was just in the water out in West Texas, and maybe some of it was Buddy Holly's influence. But whenever I hear, Waylon records where, and it's such a stripped down sound, I know that Holly was always so much about, you don't need a lot of people to make a record. You just need like 3 or 4 guys, and you don't have to have fills. You can just let the rhythm guitar be the focus and let that be the solo. And Waylon definitely, he must have learned a lot from that brief little moment that he was working with Buddy. Because I hear a lot of not obvious, but, kind of third layer of the onion type, deep down in it, little things that make me, think that influence stayed with him the whole time. It's kind of a product of its time when you think about that. Music used to be in what you call full time, where it's 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 bass snare, bass snare, bass snare, bass snare. And songs would be like this. And then somewhere in like the mid to late 60s, people started playing halftime, which gave it a deeper sound, which was instead of 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1. And the music got like this deeper groove to it because the drums were playing half as much, and it made it sound heavier. And I think Waylon was one of the first people in country music to sort of latch on to the power of that, you know, and sometimes they wouldn't even use the snare drum. You know, a lot of times it would just be the bass drum playing along with the bass and just go boom, 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 boom. It was like a march. You know, you think like a marching band with a guy with a bass drum, boom, 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 just like this heartbeat. You know, it didn't have a lot of backbeat. And before that, I mean, you listen to country music like in Hank Williams era or, you know, up through that, it's all very much on the offbeat, you know, zoom, cha, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. It's got that swing to it that you get with the offbeat. But Waylon's music had this rocky, earthy thing that put it down in the ground that was all about 1 and 3. 1 and 3 and 1, 2, 3, 4, boom, boom, boom. You know, it just basically made the bass sound bigger. And that was kind of a new thing for country music. You know, I think that's part of why he maybe got a little bit of blowback about wanting to, you know, do things his way and all that. I think a lot of people related to it because I think country music has always moved and it's always grown, and there's always been resistance within country music to play it safe and do it the same old way. But at the end of the day, country music, whether we like it or not, is a tributary of pop music. You know, you listen to Bob Wills records and it's frontier fiddle music, but influenced by big band swing. You know, you listen to Hank Williams and you hear those steel parts that Don Helms played. And he said, oh, I was just big into Artie Shaw and, like big band horn sections, those types of lines. Patsy Cline sound was basically, you know, Owen Bradley trying to compete out of Nashville with like Connie Francis and people like that who were making, you know, it was pop music, or Johnny and Jack doing those, Poison Love and Ashes of Love with the Latin beat. You know, that's when the whole rumba craze was going on in popular music, you know? So country music has always been influenced by popular music. And I think that if Waylon hadn't have done it, maybe somebody else would have. Not just like that, though. And it's great that it happened the way that it did, you know? But then with Ralph Mooney put on top of it, again, to bring things back around to Ralph Mooney, you know, just to give it that, you know, that country twangy layer of things, you know, which I don't know what Moon would have really thought about that music, you know, because he was kind of an old world country music person. You know, I don't know if I think he would, you know, have preferred being off to play with Wynn Stewart or someone like that. But what he did with that Waylon sound, I mean, when you listen to like Rainy Day Woman or something like that, it's like, man, that's like such a, you know, that heavy with, you know, it just makes you want to jump up in the air and go, yeah, country music, you know. We would run into him when I was a kid. We lived out in Bellevue, and this is at the time that him and his son Eddie had their group together, Shaver, where Eddie, you know, would play a 59 Strat through a, you know, Marshall half stack dimed, turned with the cabinet facing the back of the room because everything was, you know, it was just, the entire amp was just on 10. Man, what a great player. Eddie was such a hoss, man. He was so good. But Billy Joe was living in an apartment in Bellevue at the time. I think a subdivision called, I think it's called Doral. It's like these little kind of townhouse type apartments out in Bellevue. And we lived out in Bellevue too when I was a kid, my mom and I. And we would run into him. It was either at the Miss Winners or the Lee's Chicken, which I don't even know if there is such a thing as Lee's Chicken anymore. I haven't seen one in years, but he would always be getting like chicken and biscuits, you know, like in the mornings. We'd run into him there. And I didn't really know who he was. I was a kid. I was an elementary school age kid. And my mom would just say, he's a great writer. That guy's a really great writer. But I just remember how kind he was, you know, for being, you know, as I later learned, you know, such like a badass, like actual outlaw, you know. There was like this gentle kindness about him. I remember the first time I sort of met him as an adult, I was playing bass with Rosie Flores, and we were opening for Shaver at the Exit Inn. And this would have been about this was the first time I spent any time talking to him, but I'd opened for him before with Greg Gehring, maybe a year or two earlier at 328. But I just remember he walked up to me after the sound check and put his hand out, you know, with his nub fingers and said, "Hi, I'm Billy Joe. Thanks for playing on my show tonight," or for playing at our show tonight, you know. he didn't take ownership for the show. You know, he was just so self-effacing and just this like meek kind of modesty about him that was just so genuine. And then he gets up on stage and tells stories about shooting off guns. And, you know, I will say, I think anyone who ever saw Billy Joe Shaver can attest to this. I'm not a, you know, very religious or like traditionally spiritual person, but I will say that the experience of seeing a Billy Joe Shaver show made you feel like you were in a church. There was a certain, he had that energy of like a preacher, you know, and he could just lift the whole room up just by standing there and just singing his songs and telling his stories and just being himself. You know, there was some kind of an energy there, an electricity with that guy that, you know, and I was, you know, raised around religion, so I know what that feels like, you know, even though I don't really subscribe to it now. But I just remember only feeling that as an adult at a Billy Joe Shaver show. And it was every time I'd see him, you know, like where you almost want to smile and cry at the same time. I don't know, man, they only made one of those, you know. Marty and Roger are pals. And Marty's connection, you know, sort of to that world goes back to, you know, he came to town to play in Lester Flatt's band when he was 13 years old and lived at Roland White's house. And Roland White had, you know, his record collection was a lot of bluegrass, but then he had all these Byrds records. And Marty said, what's the deal with all these Byrds records? And he said, oh, my brother plays in the Byrds. He plays electric guitar. His name is Clarence. And so that was kind of the connection there. And of course, then Marty, 10 years or so after Clarence passed away, Marty bought Clarence's guitar from his widow, which is very significant because it's the first guitar with sort of like the modern B-bender on it, where, you know, the guitar strap attaches to the strap pin, but the strap pin is connected to a lever. And then when you're playing the guitar, if you push the neck away from you, it bends that lever and it pulls that B string up to get the pedal steel sound. And that's the only electric guitar that Marty plays and has since he acquired it in, I think, like 1984 or 83 or somewhere along those lines. So him and Roger are buddies. And when Marty had his TV show, he had Roger on the show a few times. And Marty just loves it when that Clarence White Telecaster gets to sort of, you know, weave through a song with Roger's 12-string Rickenbacker. Like, that's just such a sound. You know, it's that later version of the Byrds kind of sound. It was about to be the 50th anniversary of the Sweetheart of the Rodeo record, which was the record that they made when Graham Parsons was in the band. And it was not the first country rock recordings, but it was the first thing to really make a statement and a big splash, you know, about that sound of, you know, California rock and roll kids who dug Buck Owens and Merle Haggard wanting to make country music, but through their lens, you know. So it was going to be the 50th anniversary of that, and Roger had the idea that there should be a little tour with just like a handful of shows in select cities with him and Chris Hillman, you know, who were the only original Byrds when they made that record, and then with Marty and us as the sort of band for it. And I think the promoters and the tickets, you know, that we ended up doing a lot more dates. I think we did close to 30 of those dates. At the end of the year, Roger said, and after this, we're not going to do it ever again because the 50th anniversary will be over. And there was places we didn't go to, like we didn't go to Denver, we didn't go to Seattle or Portland. We played some show in the South Bay, but we didn't do like a proper like San Francisco show or anything. You know, there's a lot of things that we kind of passed over. And man, maybe next year we should do some more. And McGuinn's thing was, nope, that was it, just the 1 year. Now, my argument is, well, the record came out very late in '68. So really, it's the 50th anniversary until like September of the next year, right? We're still in that 50th year, but I didn't, you know, I'm just the bass player, you know, so I wasn't in a position to suggest anything like that. But yeah, man, they're great guys. Roger taught me the trick about how to take a cork from a wine bottle and just drop it on a table and then it stands up straight. On my birthday, we were on the road on my birthday. It was my, I guess my 36th birthday. And him and his wife and Chris's wife took me out to dinner. And Roger was just doing that while we were waiting for the food to come, just dropping this cork. Showed me how to drop it so it would then stand up straight on its own. I can't do it every time, but there's a little trick to it. So almost like a music box. You know, it's got this perpetual motion to it. When Roger, you know, rolls on that 12 string, it's got this, and with all the compression on it, it's got this otherworldly kind of sound. Well, back then, I don't think he's ever been really that much of like a gear-centric person. Like, a lot of people are today. I don't think a lot of the old timers were that heavy on gear. So when you meet one who is, it's kind of like, oh wow, this guy like pays attention to like how the pickup is wound and the capacitor value and that. But most of those guys back then, I think there's a story where McCartney went to a music store and they said, "What kind of bass strings do you like?" And he said, "Long shiny ones," or something like that, you know. But that's the attitude of a lot of those folks back then. You know, they was just like, I don't know, it's just that's my guitar. It's what they had at the store, so I bought it. Of course, McGuinn wanted the 12-string Rickenbacker because that's what George Harrison had that he used on A Hard Day's Night, and that was sort of the thing that made him, because he was a 12-string acoustic player, was like, man, I could start a rock and roll band. So he got one of the very first kind of production 12-string Rickenbackers that had a different body shape than Harrison's. And eventually he added a third pickup to it. Originally it was the 2 pickup model, the 360 Rickenbacker. And he had a middle pickup put in, which is, you know, from the factory, that's a 370. And I think part of the sound with him, Kenny's told me this because he's talked a lot to Roger about how he gets his sound, is it's mostly the bridge pickup, but he feeds in just a little bit of that middle pickup, which you can't do on a 360. You've got to have a 370 for that. You got to have the middle, you know, the third pickup. And a lot of compression. You know, in the studio back then, they would compress that guitar heavily. And I think sometimes they used an amplifier, and sometimes they would just DI it. They would just plug it straight into the board. And live, that's what McGuinn always does too. He had a small amp, like a little Roland Cube amp on stage, just as a monitor so we could hear it. But, you know, the house was just a DI with like a ton of compression on it. Like just squash it down to, you know, and then that makes it sound like the Byrds, you know. And it's a different sound than when George Harrison played his. You know, George played his through a Vox amplifier. Roger's thing was, you know, direct into the board with a ton of compression. I think some of those very early recordings, like I think maybe Turn, Turn, Turn was a like an Epiphone amplifier, like a Gibson-made Epiphone amp. I'm not sure, though. Don't quote me on that. But a lot of it was just DI'd, just plugged right in. A lot of times he uses this thing by a brand called Jangle Box, and people kind of talk about those, but our sound guy kind of preferred the compression that he had in the soundboard, so we went with that on that run.
Was he pleasant to be around?
Yeah, super pleasant, super great guy. You know, Hillman too. You know, we saw him a few months ago. We played in Ventura, and that's where he lives, Ventura, kind of in the Central Coast area. Yeah, he's just, you know, both of those guys are just a joy to be around. You know, we were doing a lot of unison parts because we had a lot of people on stage who could sing. And a lot of the sound of those Byrds records is double tracking things. So a lot of times we would end up, you know, like with 5 people singing, but like, you know, only 2 or 3 parts. And to give it that really lush kind of California kind of thing to it. Yeah, the first couple we did a rehearsal day at a hotel bar that we'd rented where we were staying the day before our first show in LA. And I was playing with my fingers. I wasn't, you know, I was just feeling around with different things. And then I played some with the pick, and Hillman said, like, I like it when you play with the pick, you know? And I was like, okay, because I know that he played with the pick. And that's the California 60s bass sound, is Fender bass with flat wound strings and a pick, you know? So I made a point to play with a pick, just to get that kind of, you know, 60s pick bass California Byrds. I just use what I always, you know, I play bass with a pick pretty regularly. Hillman said he always used a light pick, like a 63 gauge or whatever. Like, you know, some of the nylon picks, they have the gauge written on there, like a pretty floppy kind of pick, which would give you a little more of that puh kind of sound. But I like a thicker pick with bass. Carol Kay always used a thick pick, and I think Joe Osborne did too. And they did most of the bass session work in California back then. And now I was playing bass on some of the stuff, but once we got to the Sweetheart stuff, I was playing steel, and Kenny was playing the bass. And Marty made a big point to have me play everything note for note as close as I could to Lloyd, even down to like fills. Like if there was certain fills, you know, he'd just sit his chair just right across from me, just kind of like how I am with you right now. He'd say, all right, now let's play the song. And on that bit, can you do do-do-do-do-do? And he played on the Clarence Telecaster, do-do-do-do-do. And I go, na-na-na-na-na. Yeah, that's it. And he kind of, you know, he was like steel guitar, Lloyd Green, Sweetheart of the Rodeo boot camp. And it paid off because when we played at the Ryman, Lloyd was there. He was sitting with Eric Brace, I think about 7 rows back, right in front of me, watching me. So I was, you know, as Maxine Brown would have said, I was nervous as a whore in church. But
how many bands would would try that hard to make it right.
Probably not a lot. Probably not a lot. And that was all, Marty's, motivation and work ethic that made that what it was. I think it was a special thing, that whole tour. I wish we could have done a little bit more of them. Like I said, we could have gone through the next year up until September. Would have been 50th anniversary still. Another interesting thing about that record is at least I can't hear it, any 12-string Rickenbacker on that record. There's no prominent parts played with it. It's basically a steel record. It's basically Lloyd Green. There's 3 or 4 songs on that record that have J.D. Manis on steel that were cut in California. But for the most part, whether it be J.D. or Lloyd, which is the most of it, it's a steel guitar record as far as the prominent lead instrument goes, which was a real departure for that band because it had always been about the 12-string before that. And Clarence started doing sessions with them a couple records before that one. And there's a few songs that he played on The Sweetheart. 100 Years From Now, Lloyd told me the story about that. That was the one song, that was the last song they cut on the record. And they had already done all their work in Nashville. And so they needed to fly Lloyd out to L.A. to cut. And they had to do it on a Sunday because Lloyd was booked so far in advance. That was the one day of the week that he could. So he flew all the way out to L.A., did that one song, and then flew all the way home. And that was the one time that he worked with Clarence. And there's debate over whether or not Clarence's guitar had the pedal on it at that time, the pull string bender, and over which guitar it was. And I asked Lloyd, I said, so which guitar was he playing? Was it the white one that Bob Warford owns, or was it the Sunburst one that Marty has? He said, it was the one that Marty has. And I said, was the pedal on it already? He said, yeah, he showed me how it works. And Lloyd, his memory is impeccable. So if Lloyd said it, that's good enough for me. We were playing with Marty Stewart in Northern California, and we had a day off in Redding. And Marty said, came and woke us all up early and said, hey, Hag's picking us up and taking us out to breakfast. Sometimes the thing is he would take them to this spot in Redding called Lulu's, this little greasy spoon diner cafe where old men congregate, But this day we were going to go to his home in, I guess it's Palo Cedro, California. So he picked us up, man, and he looked totally gangster. He had a white Escalade, like the pickup truck version of the Escalade, with big rims. And he had this like flat brim, like California people, they wear like their baseball caps with the brim like dead flat. He had that with like this huge like camo kind of overcoat on. Like he looked like a rapper. Which kind of makes sense when you think about like his background and sort of the world that he came up in was, if he had been 50 years younger, that probably would have been more his culture, So he picked us up, this Bakersfield gangster, picks us up in this white Escalade, and all 4 of us pile in. Marty's in the front seat with Hag, who's driving, and then Kenny and Harry and I are on the back seat. Drives us out to his house. And, that was the only one time I got to really spend, I would say, meaningful time around him. But I'd been in his presence a couple times before, and the thing that always got me was that intensity, like this calm, deep intensity in his stare, in his eyes. Like there was something very deep there that I think anyone who's listened to Merle Haggard has picked up on. But you could see it in him too, So we get to his property, and there's these landscapers there. And they're planting redwood trees, just baby redwood trees, these little things. And he was saying, I think they were like $1,700 a tree to plant. He was kind of complaining about that, but planting like hundreds of redwood trees that day on his property. Maybe not hundreds, but, a lot of them. And I was thinking to myself, like, man, you think about what those trees become. You think about those trees when they're 800 or 1,200 years old, and they're, you could carve a tunnel through it and drive a car through. And I was thinking of, I think it's a Buddhist saying, about wise men who plant trees that they know they'll never sit under the shade of. And this was about a year before he passed away. And, I don't think anyone was expecting him to pass right when he did. He'd been sick off and on for years, but no matter what, there was no way he was going to sit under those redwood trees, but somebody will. So we went out to the house. The house was actually Fuzzy Owen's house. Fuzzy Owen was, steel player from Bakersfield and Hag's sort of manager for, many, many years. And it was a very modest place. I don't think it was really a double wide, but it had this kind of fabricated aspect to it. Just this little house on this huge property. And, you know, we had biscuits and gravy and eggs and bacon and sausage and all that. And I'm in the good position of around somebody like him. The country music I love the most is the era before him. So when I was, you know, able to be around somebody like him, instead of asking him about Roy Nichols and recording at Capitol and, you know, Ralph Mooney and all the stuff that, although he probably would have loved to talk about Roy and Ralph Mooney because he was such a fan of Pickers. But instead of asking him about his career, I just wanted to talk to him about like Bob Wills and the Maddox Brothers and Ernest Tubb and Lefty Frizzell. And that's what made his eyes light up, because I've told people for years, in addition to being like one of country music's biggest stars, you're not going to find a country music fan anywhere bigger than Merle Haggard. So I think most of that day we just, you know, kind of talked about the Maddoxes and Bob Wills and sat on the couch and, you know, played some music and got to strum Lefty's Bigsby J200. You know, it's dry out there in California, and the guitar had been in Nashville for years. It was after Lefty died, it was on display at the Country Music Hall of Fame for probably 20 years. And backstory here, one day Marty went to the Hall of Fame and the J200 was gone. And he asked somebody there, like, what happened to the Lefty guitar? And they said the family took it back. And he said, we didn't own that. Like, you know, this was back when he was president of the CMF. He just figured that that was part of the collection, but it still belonged to the Frizzell family. They listed it for sale at Retrofret in Brooklyn, the family, to the Frizzell family. And I can't remember how much they wanted for it. I think it was like $250,000 or something, you know, a lot of money, which, I mean, I'd say worth every penny. I mean, that's Lefty's, you know, that's the Lefty Frizzell guitar. And it's, you know, and the Bigsby neck on it too just makes it one of just very few, you know, acoustic guitars in the world of that, you know, of that pedigree. So he called Haggard and said, you know, you need to buy Lefty's guitars at Retrofret. And he kind of talked him into it and played it for him, and then hand delivered it to him out in California a few years earlier. So it had been in California now for a few years, and I think there was a couple like seams that were kind of pulling apart. There was a couple just little things just from being out in the dry California heat, you know. So it comes out in the case, you know, it's not the original case. He takes it out and hands it to me. Haggard just hands me Lefty's guitar and starts talking about Long Black Veil. And, you know, Lefty played that guitar, I'm sure, on most of those Jim Beck records that were made in Dallas in the, you know, early and mid 50s, like If You Got the Money and I Love You a Thousand Ways and Mom and Dad's Waltz and all of those. But that was, I mean, he was proud of that guitar. It's hard to find a picture of Lefty Frizzell where he doesn't have that Bigsby necked Gibson J200. You know, it's almost like a part of his outfit, that guitar. So he starts talking about Long Black Veil. Haggard does. And he says, and a lot of people don't know this, but Grady Martin played rhythm guitar on Long Black Veil. And Grady he didn't have an acoustic with him because he was mostly a lead player. So he played Lefty's Bigsby neck J200. He played that guitar. And he said, strum it. It sounds just like the record. And so I started strumming an E chord. Boom, da-da-doo. And he started singing, 10 years ago, on a cold, dark night, there was someone killed 'neath the town hall light. And he was doing it with that Haggard singing like Lefty voice, you know. And to backtrack even further, you know, one of the first moments of inspiration for Haggard in show business was him and a friend went to see Lefty Frizzell play in Bakersfield. And they snuck backstage, and they were kind of hiding behind a plant. I believe this is how the story goes. They're like this fern or whatever backstage. They were hiding behind this plant. And somebody came out, like some security guy, hey, you kids, get out of here. And Lefty was walking by right then, and Haggard's friend said, hey, Mr. Frizzell, my friend here can sing just like you. And Lefty took that J200 and handed it to like a 14-year-old Merle Haggard and said, well, shit, son, then go out there and sing some of my songs. And pushed him out on stage with his band, with his guitar, and he sang 3 Lefty Frizzell songs. So that was kind of like one of the first moments that, and I think later, you know, in prison, he saw Johnny Cash perform. Those were sort of these, you know, cornerstone moments for him. So he had this guitar. So I start strumming that E chord, and he starts singing Long Black Veil. And he gets to the end of the first verse and then kind of stops. And there's that moment, you know, when you're playing music where you're living just on the edge of every moment. Like you can tell, is it going to go to a 4 chord? Is it going to go, you know, where you're very alert when you're playing music, like micro level alert to things within a second. I could tell he was done singing. He kind of turned away, and it was time for the second verse. So, or the third verse. So I came in with, You know, the verse where she cries over his bones, you know, the last verse. I'd have to sing through the whole song now to get to that point, but as we had that day, it was on the tip of my tongue. And then he kind of looked over at me and kind of got this kind of grin, but like this grin, like, I don't know. He had that energy about him, like someone who'd been in prison, you know, where like, even if he like had a little bit of a grin, you couldn't tell if he was happy or if he was pissed off, or like if he was, you know, gonna, you know, shank you in the shower later with a, you know, toothbrush knife or something. I mean, you know, I'm not, you know, trying to, he just had that kind of jailhouse like poker face about him. I don't know, man, those were deep waters, you know, that cat. It was great to play that guitar, and then he had his custom shop Fender Tough Dog Telecaster with the neck through design and the funny pick guard on it. You know, the Merle Haggard Telly that he played like the last couple decades. He had his personal one there, and so we sat around. There was a bass, and we just sat around and played music that afternoon. I look back at pictures of it too, and going back to the thing of him being like a gangster, like a Bakersfield gangster, like the pictures, he's got his guitar and I've got Lefty's guitar, which was also his. And then on the coffee table, you see there's like a joint and then a big stack of $100 bills. I was like, yeah, you know, like just sitting there, you know, and then like a legal pad with like some scribbling on it. But it was, I don't know. It was a modest home. It was a very, very modest place. Wasn't putting on any airs in that place. I'd say, you know, I mean, that 60s era Capitol stuff is just so good. Anything with well, like some of the stuff with James Burton is just so great. The stuff with Ralph Mooney, you know, a lot of times I listen to records with the perspective of the pickers on it, which was the same thing that pulled him in too. You know, you could tell that he was always trying to impress Roy Nichols. You know, he looked up to him because he had been the guitar player for the Maddox Brothers and Rose. I'd say, you know, from that, from now on, all my friends are going to be strangers, kind of that era, you know, that early kind of fresh face when it was still coming together, but it was already all there. I don't know. I just love that stuff. And that's the stuff that's got a lot of Ralph Mooney on it. And I don't know. We kind of knew it was coming, you know, playing with Marty because they were so close. Marty presided his funeral. So we kind of knew it was coming. And there was an irony that he passed away on his 79th birthday. There's a lot of contradictions, I think, beautiful contradictions with Merle Haggard. You know, he was kind of this rebel jailhouse outlaw who sang songs about that sort of tugged at people's sense of compassion, like Lonesome Fugitive or Branded Man and tunes like that, where you kind of sympathize with these people who are kind of on the outskirts of society. But then he could kind of like be this guy who towed the line and, you know, held the flag for the establishment with Fight Inside of Me and Okie from Muskogee and all that sort of, you know, there was these contradictions like, well, what is he? Is he an outlaw or is he like this straight-laced guy who's supporting the man, you know? There's a lot of contradictions in his whole thing. And I think that's part of the interesting thing about Merle Haggard. That's what kind of tickles the brain. And I think it was really like the last act of that was the fact that he died on his birthday. You know, just this like yin and yang thing of Merle Haggard, you know. And he died on his bus, I believe. He wanted to be on the bus when he passed, you know, because he was like a lifelong, you know, I guess we're all kind of hobos, musicians, you know, traveling musicians. He just had gotten a new bus too. Really nice bus. Like probably cost a lot more than the house cost, you know. And he was proud of it too. And so he was, I believe, on that bus and, you know, laying in the bed. He had given us a tour. He wanted to show us the bus because he was real proud of it when we were there that day about a year earlier. And the bed, you know, he had a full bed in it. And then above, in this like kind of needlepoint, like old lady looking needlepoint frame over the bed said, "Nothing gets laid on this bed except Mrs. Haggard." Basically, like, don't put your shit on the bed, you know? So nothing gets laid on this bed except for Mrs. Haggard. And then I laughed, and then I couldn't help but notice something was on the bed, and it was a violin case. I said, you know, what's in the case? He said, Bob Will's fiddle. So there are exceptions.